Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, and honored guests. My name is Anne-Marie BUZATU, and I'm the Vice President and Chief Operating Officer for ICT for Peace Foundation, a foundation based in Geneva, Switzerland, that looks at how we can promote peace, security, stability, and protection of human rights online. And this is something of which we are in dire need, as the headlines tell us every day. The dramatic increase of cyber attacks, particularly during the pandemic, where we have come to become more dependent on these technologies, has shed intensified light on the need to have increased and intensified global efforts to bring about security and stability online. At the same time, 2021 was a kind of banner year in terms of developments in multilateral efforts to set international norms for how governments and other actors should behave online. And just a few highlights: the open-ended working group and the developments in the field of information and telecommunications in the context of international security, it's a mouthful, issued its consensus report in March, reaffirming the 11 norms that had already been articulated in the UN Group of Governmental Experts report from 2015. That same group, in its 2021 report, the UN Group of Governmental Experts on Advancing Responsible State Behavior in Cyberspace in the Context of International Security, issued its report also, consensus report in May, reaffirming those 11 norms and actually putting more meat on the bone of those norms. Then we had a meeting at the Security Council, which held its first formal session, actually led by Estonia, to recognize the challenges of peace and security and cybersecurity on peace and security. We also had a program of action that was issued by France and Egypt and supported by more than 50 governments looking to establish a permanent institution in the UN to support the cooperation of states in cyberspace. And then finally, if that were not enough, Russia and US issued a statement, a joint resolution to end the bifurcation that has been going on with the UNGGE and the Open-Ended Working Group to form one working group, Open-Ended Working Group for 2021 to 2025. So now, as we are on the cusp and gearing up for 2022, with a new Open-Ended Working Group now constituted, what can we expect on the horizon in terms of normative efforts to secure cyberspace? Fortunately, we have on this panel exactly the right people to answer this question. Ones who can really shed light on what the future holds in peace and security in cyberspace. And so on that note, I'm going to introduce my very esteemed panel guests in alphabetical order. So brief introductions, starting with Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Singapore to the UN, Burhan Ghafoor, who is also the newly appointed chair of the 2021-2025 Open-Ended Working Group on the develops in the field of information and telecommunications in the context of international security. Prior to this, Ambassador Ghafoor served as Singapore's High Commissioner to Australia. He also has a very high-level career beforehand, ambassador and chief negotiator for the United Nations climate change negotiations, ambassador to France, permanent representative to the UN in Geneva, and several other important roles on the world stage. And then the next on my very high-level list is Alar KARIS, who was recently elected president of Estonia just a little over a month ago. I think you took office. He has a very interesting background as a molecular geneticist and development biologist who became a professor at the Estonian University of Life Sciences in 1999. He also served as rector of the same university from 2003 to 2007, served as director of University of Tartu from 2007 to 2012, and was appointed Estonia's Auditor General in March 2013, and director of the Estonian National Museum since 2017. Next on my list is Izumi NAKAMITSU, who is the Undersecretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, appointed to that role on the 1st of May 2017. Prior to this, she served as Assistant Administrator of the Crisis Response Unit at the UN Development Program since 2014. Let me get to my next page. and has many years of experience inside and outside the UN system, most recently a special advisor at interim and follow-up to the summit on addressing large movements of refugees and migrants between 2016 and 2017. Next on my list, and we're very happy to see you, given the U.S.'s new support for this initiative, is Anne Neuberger, Deputy National Security Advisor for Cybersecurity and Emerging Technology for the Biden administration since early 2021. Prior to this, she worked for 10 years at the U.S. National Security Agency, where she held a number of positions as Cybersecurity Director, co-lead of the Elections Security Group, and Chief Risk Officer, among other roles. And she also served as the Navy's Deputy Chief Management Officer and a Special Advisor to the Secretary of Navy. Before joining government service, she was Senior Vice President of Operations and American Stock Transfer and Trust Company for 14 years. And last, but certainly not least, is Brad Smith, President of Microsoft since 2015, although he's been working there since 1993. Prior to that, you worked as an associate and then partner at the law firm of Covington and in Burlington, and is remembered as the first attorney on the firm to insist in 1986 on having a personal computer at his desk as a conditioning for accepting a job offer. Active in several civic organizations and in the broader technology industry, serving on several boards. I also know that he's an alma mater of the Graduate Institute of International Relations, also an institution that I know very well, that's located in my hometown of Geneva. So a warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for helping us to shed light on some of these important issues. Now, we have 3 panelists that are connecting remotely. We have 2 that are here. This is a little bit of a challenging context, but as much as possible, I'm going to try to make this an organic conversation. So let's see how we can make this work. If you feel something that you really want to add, to a question, please signal, and we'll try to bring that in. And let's see how we can get this going. But I'm going to start off with the first question, which is, so I'm going to start this with, Izumi Nakamitsu, please. Why do you say is international cooperation in interoperable norms on cybersecurity essential to foster a safer and more secure cyberspace? And just to say, I would then actually like to bring in Brad Smith on this question, as well as Burhan Kafur afterwards. So let's see how we can get a little bit of a conversation going. And now over to you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Hello from Seoul, South Korea,
Wow.
where I am on mission. The connection works, right?
It's working very well. I hear you loud and clear.
Yes.
So glad to have you here.
Why it is necessary? I think it's quite very clear. Malicious use of cyberspace by state and, I would say, non-state actors very much is really increasing, in number of incidents. It's also sophistication and diversity of harmful ICT incidents really increasing. And all of those trends are really further exacerbating threats to international peace and security. And so, combating peace and security risks in cyberspace really is necessary to build cooperation and trust among states. I mean, trust is a key word in today's peace and security, and that's why we need to work on this through international cooperation. Because, through cooperation, we will be able to increase predictability, reduce risk of misperception and miscalculation. And they also, seek to ensure cooperation and information exchange, preventing escalation. All of those things are quite important. Now, I'm going to quote the Secretary General Guterres's message to Paris International Forum, because this is a global issue. No state can do this alone, and therefore solidarity and cooperation is the only way. And that's why we have to work on this through cooperation.
So thank you for your answer very much. I will now pass the floor to Brad Smith, but I'm also going to ask you to focus on the norms aspect, if you could do.
Sure, and I can build on that last answer. And I often find that people ask an important but skeptical question. They ask, why should we strengthen norms if we know our adversaries are going to violate them? And my response is, why should we pass laws in any country if we know criminals will break them? Violations are part of life, but laws define the line between acceptable and unacceptable conduct. Once the line is clear, many responsible people adjust and they adapt and they adhere to the norms. And then some do not. But when they do not, we have the basis for accountability, to investigate, to attribute, to respond. So in many, many ways, and I think often in ways that we don't necessarily appreciate, so much of order, safety, begins with the drawing and strengthening of norms.
No, and I really appreciate your answer, actually. It's something that we've seen in many areas, but the complexity of cyberspace, it's everything and nothing in some ways. But to already start to have some bright lines that we can say, this is the good way, this is the bad way, to make it more clear. And especially as we have the influence of so many private actors that are really shaping cyberspace, I think it's important that we also look at what are those behaviors and what works, what is contributing to the kind of international stability that we all want to have, and what isn't. So, yeah.
Well put.
Yeah, thanks. Now, next, I'd like to give the floor to Ambassador Burnham Gafoor. And I'm also going to put the twist a little bit for you. You're now in this new role as a chair of the new open-ended working group. So a little bit, if you could put that spin on how you see that contributing to the international cooperation and interoperable norms, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Anne, and good morning to everyone. Good morning from New York. It's 6 a.m. here. Very, very happy to join this conversation. First of all, I want to say that at the UN, there is a growing sense that cyberspace must be treated like a global commons, no different from, say, outer space or oceans or even climate change, in the sense that the global cyberspace is not something that any one country can protect and defend. And that is where international cooperation comes in. The UN has been doing quiet work in this area for the last 15 years. I think we are talking about cyber in recent years as a very pressing and urgent issue, but the UN actually has been working quietly in this domain in terms of preparing and discussing norms. As you said, and it has been a banner year this year, especially because we have been able to reach some adoption of consensus reports that have, I think, strengthened the framework of norms, rules, and principles of responsible state behavior. Now, the question is, what exactly is the value of this framework? I mean, as Brad was saying, laws and rules may be violated, but I think a framework of norms creates a strong expectations among states that their peers must abide by these norms in order to demonstrate responsible state behavior. And if they do not demonstrate responsible state behavior, then I think there is the consequent step of some degree of accountability, which can take place at bilateral levels or regional levels, or even possibly at the UN. And therefore, I think the value of international cooperation is that, first of all, it creates a basis or parameters for basic rules of the road, I would say. And secondly, let's not forget that the UN itself is a confidence-building mechanism, because people come here, 193 countries, with vastly different views and vastly different expectations, and from time to time, different threat assessments. And so engaging in an exercise, sitting around a table where we are simply talking, that in itself helps to build trust and confidence. And the last reason I wanted to highlight as to why we need international cooperation, not just at the regional and bilateral levels, but here at the UN, is because we need to build capacity. Let's not forget that cyber affects everyone, but not everyone has the capacity to deal or even understand the threat posed by cyber. And that is where international cooperation is needed. And by the way, when we talk about international cooperation, it's not just between states. we also need the private sector. So companies like Brad's company, they have the technology expertise to help many countries, many small and vulnerable countries who don't even have the capacity to understand and know if their systems are being attacked. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, but I also appreciate you're both bringing in the private sector aspect as well as the capacity building sector. And I, as a civil society organization that has participated in a lot of these different initiatives, including the informal consultations for the open-ended working group, I'm also actually teaching a course this week, have my last class this afternoon to the OAS on specifically cyber norms, law, and diplomacy. So it's very, timely, this discussion. So I would just come back to you actually with some of the questions that I'm hearing from my students and from the ones that are looking at this. What kind of roles do you see in the open-ended working group going forward to make sure that we have the inclusion of these different voices, including private sector, including civil society, which was quite active in the previous session, and I think made a really important contribution to shaping not just the consensus report, but also the chair's summary, which reflects, I think, a lot of the different diverse groups. So if you would say a few words, I would very much appreciate it.
Is that for me?
Yeah, that's for you.
All right, thank you very much. No, happy to come back. No, I think that's a very important question. I think at the UN, we are offering a platform, a neutral platform, if you like, for countries around the world to sit around the same table and talk about these difficult issues. But this conversation cannot be just between states. So it is my intention as chair of this process to allow private sector, civil society, think tanks, academics, and experts to be involved in this conversation in an informal way. And I think we began already this process in 2019, December, under the previous open-ended working group, which was chaired by Switzerland, yes, where we held an informal consultative dialogue with stakeholders. Now, the question is whether these meetings should be formal or informal. But what really matters is that we have a conversation. It does not matter what the shape of the table is. Sometimes we get obsessed by that at the UN here, but what matters really is that we need a conversation with stakeholders around a table, whether it's a formal or an informal table. And that is my intention, and to start a process of dialogue that is not just one-off, that we do it for symbolic purposes to tick the box, but to have a dialogue that is systematic, sustained, and substantive, because we do need ideas from the private sector and other stakeholders in terms of what states must do, what must states do in terms of expectations, and what the private sector and others can do in terms of helping to build capacity. And more importantly, I think when we are talking of partnerships, we also need to be talking in terms of partnership between stakeholders as well as governments. So I am confident that we can create a place for this conversation within the UN. And it is my hope that, those who are watching this program, for example, it is my hope that people will be willing to come to the UN to take advantage of this platform, to have that conversation, because providing that venue is one thing, but attracting the people to tell them that this is a worthwhile conversation that they must participate in is another thing. And I hope that we will get there.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm personally quite invested in this process as well, so I'm hoping that I will see you in some of the future meetings and that we can continue these discussions. So I'm going to move on to what's kind of the guiding question too that we talked about. How can multi-stakeholder initiatives such as the Paris Call help institutional and intergovernmental discussions to building cyber norms? And I thought I would give the floor first to Anne Neuberger, as the U.S. has now just recently endorsed the Paris Call, to kind of explain the value that you see in this initiative for these discussions.
Absolutely. Good morning, Anne. Good morning, all. Like Ambassador Gafour calling in from the U.S., it's a pleasure to be here early in the morning. I'm truly honored to be with my distinguished panel here. As you noted, we firmly believe that a secure, interoperable, reliable internet is core to the rules-based order and to our global commons. This is why the U.S. developed and really endorsed the Framework of Responsible State Behavior in Cyberspace, which has three components. First, the belief that international law applies to cyberspace, the belief in voluntary norms. And I'll highlight a couple of them specifically because they relate very closely to the themes in the Paris Call, one of the reasons we were very honored to join. First, that states shouldn't allow their territory to be used for malicious activity against others, for example, as we see with ransomware, and no intentional damage to critical infrastructure. That's just a couple of examples of the voluntary norms that have been endorsed, as was noted earlier, by both the UN and member states. And then finally, as the third component of our principles of responsible state behavior in cyberspace, is putting in place the coordination and the communication to avoid misunderstandings, which can occur easily in cyberspace given the challenges of technical attribution and just given the challenges of a global environment as it is. We've been honored to see the progress that has occurred in the UN building upon that framework. And indeed, in this spirit, really is why we elected to join our allies and partners, as well as companies and civil society, as you noted, in supporting the Paris Call, and particularly noting the role of private sector participants and their unique role in the security of the technology underpinning our global internet. As we look to what comes and follows the Paris Call, we look to build on, for example, that component I just noted, putting in place the communication and coordination to defend cyberspace. That's one of the reasons that we began by pulling together an international coalition to fight ransomware, hosting at the White House 31 countries and the European Union to take on the governmental part of it, bringing together enforcing anti-money laundering laws for cryptocurrency, government and private sector partnerships on disrupting of ransomware networks and infrastructure, and certainly diplomatic aspects and resilience aspects. And in each of those, the partnership, as you noted, between government and private sector, whether in implementing resilience and implementing disruption of malicious cyber networks globally around the world, is key to its effectiveness.
Thank you so much for that. I'd like to, I really appreciate how much you note the importance of this cooperation with the different actors. And, once again, from my perspective, also having worked quite a bit in multi-stakeholder approaches to governance, it's really important to identify the particular skills and areas of expertise and basically kind of their own effective control, whether they are large companies or whether they are civil society organizations. If we want to try to build a more robust and secure internet, everybody has to play their part. So thank you for that. I'm going to pose the same question to President Alar KARIS. How do you see multi-stakeholder initiatives like this one contributing to these intergovernmental discussions and institutional discussions?
Good afternoon. These two first questions are actually kind of interlinked, so it's very, very much common. I'm coming from a country which is very small, but very digital. So that's why we know is cybercrime and cyber attacks already for more than 2 decades. And that's why I'm convinced that we must ensure that cyberspace is not a Wild West, that you cannot carry out cyber attacks and get away with it. And that means we must show that the malicious use of cyberspace is not without consequences. And from my point of view, or from my perspective, I can point out which involves 3 key aspects. Some of them are already mentioned. And first of all, we need to implement the existing norms and provisions of international law. And we know that cyber attacks are an act of crime and therefore punishable by law. And we should not reinvent the wheel, because rather than focusing on new norms, we must implement what we have already agreed. And the second, no rules will be followed if guilty are not accountable.
bring the microphone.
Sorry. So I understand it's not an easy task, but I should say that Estonia has been hosted at first ever official meeting on cybersecurity in the UN Security Council. So this is why we work hard in the framework of UN and have a cyber toolbox in place. And maybe most importantly, mentioned by the ambassador already, that we need capacity to deal with these kind of risks. And obviously, this doesn't come for free. It requires funds, clear goals, and educated experts. In many countries, spending on cybersecurity is still highly fragmented. And what would help here will be a collectively established best practices on cybersecurity investments. And likewise, we should support cyber capacity building in countries who are in early stages of digitalization. And one of the greatest obstacles to achieving this is a lack of experts. I am not an expert, but Europe alone lacks around 300,000 cyber experts. And globally the gap is even in millions. So these are the three aspects I would like to emphasize, and later on, if we have time, I can also show some or give some examples of what we have done in Estonia as far as government and other organizations has done together.
Thank you so much for that. And Estonia really has been a leader in this area. Because perhaps of some historical aspects that nevertheless brought this topic really firmly on the agenda of Estonia. And having worked so much, I've also been to Tallinn and worked at the Center of Excellence. It's really remarkable, many of the things that you've done, and also great that you had those issues in the Security Council earlier this year. So maybe, I don't know if we will have time. Unfortunately, this is a short session, but we can discuss later for sure. So now I'm going to go to question 3, which is basically what actions could be taken or contribution made by cyber stakeholders worldwide to help advance multilateral discussions on creating better frameworks and norms on cybersecurity. Now, this is to everybody, and maybe we just go in alphabetical order because it's the simplest. But what I really am interested in, and I would like to hear, are some kind of calls to action. Something that's a little that we can walk away with and go, okay, let's do these things. So with that request, I guess I will first pass to Ambassador Gafour. What should we do, and what is your call to action?
Well, thank you very much, and. I think the first thing we need to do at the UN here is to make the transition from talking to action. Indeed, that was one of the points that I was going to make. Because the UN has been working on these issues for the last 10, 15 years. But there is a lot of expectations by many countries that now is the time for implementing what has been agreed. The norms or a framework of norms, rules, and principles have been agreed. They provide a normative framework or parameters. It's time to implement them. But implementation means a few things. First, I think we need to raise awareness of what these norms are. Mm-hmm. I think many countries are not really aware what those norms mean for them. That's number one. Raising awareness of these rule book, so to speak, is something that's very important. That's where I think the private sector and other partners can also work with the UN process to publicize and raise awareness of these parameters around the world. Second, I think we need to come back to capacity building. Now, I think capacity building, we have been talking about it for years, but I think we need to work on it. For example, what institutions or structures do countries need at the national level in order for them to have that international cooperation with other countries? What do countries need to do in order to establish points of contact at the technical or the political level? So I'd really like to see a very specific focus on helping countries at the national level set up structures and institutions. I think the third thing that I think members are discussing is to do some kind of survey of what they have done themselves. So that will show where the gaps are. What do countries need? Where do the assistance needs to come in? So each country, in a sense, has to take some responsibility for these measures so that they are ready for the international cooperation and the international discussions that will need to take place. The last point I wanted to make is with regard to regional organizations. What we have now is a situation where some regions are very advanced. The OSCE is a good example, very well advanced in terms of discussions on CBMs, confidence building measures. I think the OAS has also done some work, and in Southeast Asia, where Singapore is located, ASEAN and the ARF have also begun some discussions. But I think if we just focus on regional organizations, we run the risk of neglecting big chunks of the planet. And therefore, we need to find a way where we build on the national, regional, and from the regional, bring it up to the global level by sharing lessons from different parts of the world here at the UN or at the UN process, so that different countries from different parts of the world can understand what's happening in other regions, what could be applied in one region, how do they relate or be useful to another region. So that's the kind of sharing of experiences that I think is needed, again, to build capacity, to raise awareness, and hopefully, to build trust in order to create that secure and safe cyberspace we need. Thank you.
Thank you. And I really appreciate your bringing this, the idea of sharing practices developed in different places, because, as you rightly say, there is a digital divide. There are places that are far more advanced than others, but they're all also in these perhaps less developed places, some very interesting practices, lessons that could be learned and shared. If we could create a forum in which those types of exchanges can be made, we can help, bring more people on board. And certainly the pandemic has been driving that to a large degree. I'm going to now pass the microphone or floor to Alar KARIS. What would you see in terms of our calls to action and what we can do?
I mean, I used to be a scientist, and education is extremely important for me. So I stick to this idea that we need to have education on this field, IT field, together with cybersecurity. So starting from maybe from primary school already. I myself, in Estonia, we have a very good example of kind of competition which are between different schools, different teams. So what they did, they kind of responded to a cyber attack. So there was a competition, and we are planning to make it international. That means to involve more schoolboys, schoolgirls from different countries, online or not online, to have this kind of competitions. But they know what this cyber attack actually means, and they can respond. So this is something we should do. And as I mentioned, education on very starting already from the primary school. And as I said, it's not this kind of education is not a piece of a cake, but it's a layer of a cake. So that means anything you teach, there should be an element of IT, there should be an element of cybersecurity.
I thank you so much. And what I also appreciate, I think, one of the things that sometimes is a little bit lost is that we are all important players in this, as we are users of technology. And if we don't know how to warn against certain risks or identify things that might be, we become vectors for attacks ourselves. If we accidentally click on a link, or we, forward something that we shouldn't, we could actually, or we don't update our devices with the latest security patches, we can be the vector for these types of attacks. So even very basic education on cyber hygiene is an excellent start that we all need to have, all ages. So I will now pass the floor to Izumi NAKAMITSU. Please, what are your calls to action?
Thank you. I want to build on what Ambassador Gafour said. Obviously, he articulated the important link at the national level efforts, regional level efforts, and then at the global level efforts. And that's actually exactly how Singapore has been really exemplary. I mean, supporting the capacities of different nations, especially in the ASEAN region. ASEAN, through the leadership of Singapore, quite early on endorsed and embraced the 11 norms of voluntary norms of responsible state behavior. And now, of course, taking the chair of the UN Open-Ended Working Group, the second iteration of it, to further develop the norms. Now, I think what we need to do, because he talked so much about the importance of capacity building, I would like to also focus on the norms. I think going on, we need to make sure that what we already have, and I must say it's quite rich, what the GGE report that was adopted by consensus has, I think it's 11 pages of a very, very detailed guidance on how to go about implementing the 11 norms. So we must definitely build on what we already have and start actually implementing them. And also start identifying what kind of a framework that we could put together. And through that framework, and there is, as you know, discussions that are emerging now to put together some sort of a program of action.
Yes.
And this program of action will be hopefully discussed and concretized, quite early on in the OEWG. Through that sort of a political framework, we at the international level will be also able to support each and every country to implement those norms that we have or they have been already building. So I think we need to come together, at all different levels and advance on creating a better implementation framework. And let's not forget that, cyber field, as Gafour already mentioned, there is a very strong sense that this has to be looked at as a global commons. And therefore, everyone has to come together, including individual citizens and industry, civil society, and then, look at ourselves, what that means to be responsible behavior in the cyberspace, and not just the state, but also each and every one of us. So there's a really big opportunity in front of us. And I hope that the next, let's say, 2 years or so, we will be able to make a very quick advances in many of those areas through the OEWG that are starting in 1 month's time.
Yes. So a lot of expectations for the open-ended working group coming up. I want to thank you for also raising the program of action. Of course, that's a very important initiative. I wish we had more time to talk about it. So it's something that we won't go into too much detail today. But I also echo your statement that I hope the open-ended working group will certainly look at this going forward. And I also appreciate the idea of the norms. And one of the things that my organization did as part of a civil society comment to the first committee recently, just last month, was to ask that the states make good on the recommendations that they explain how they think international law applies in cyberspace. So these types of statements where it's more clearly articulated, what does it mean? It's not that it does, but how does it apply, I think would be very welcome in advancing those discussions. Okay, so Anne, it's now your turn. What are your calls to action?
And I really loved your question because the question wasn't about new norms, it was about implementing the norms that we have. And that was the point a number of the panelists made as well, how we are at a moment in time when we can actually do so. So I'll take the perspective of the practitioner. In the U.S., I'm responsible for coordinating and managing a national response to a major national security incident. So from a practitioner's perspective, building on the points Ambassador Gafour and the President of Estonia made regarding building capacity and actual execution in the event something occurs, and how we do indeed build upon these norms. So I'll pick two particular norms that have been endorsed by the UN and member states related to states being accountable for malicious activity coming from within their borders, with a particular focus on not disrupting critical infrastructure. And to your point about a call to action, when we launched the counter-ransomware initiative, the goal was to really understand each country's practices, what each country saw as best practices that they could share with others as part of capacity building, as well as understand what are the key gaps countries articulated so that those, to your earlier point, Anne, with greater capacity and expertise can bring that to the global goal of lifting up all participants in this space. And from the discussions over 2 days, with countries crossing from more nascent capacity to countries with greater amount of capacity, what we saw was first at the national level, the call to action was to integrate efforts across law enforcement, diplomatic efforts, financial efforts in a holistic response. And second, to begin implementing efforts like anti-monitoring laws and law enforcement cooperation that are very much in place in the physical world, but are in some cases still nascent in the virtual world. So coming out of that effort, we will be launching a plan of action to build out that specific capacity, matching up countries with greater capacity with those who seek and have identified gaps in those areas. From the private sector call to action, the technology all of us rely on, from the technology that maintains our clean water to the technology increasingly and the sensors that identify whether disruptions in our power or disruptions in our financial systems are built and designed by the private sector. And baking in security by design, making things like authentication default so they're easier to implement, are really a call to action for the private sector. And then finally, Anne, to your point about civil society, I want to highlight organizations like Code.org that have done so much to address the human gaps we have globally around the world in cybersecurity skills and expertise. There's such cool opportunities in this space. People don't necessarily need advanced degrees at all. They need a curiosity, a desire to learn, and different certifications that some companies have put in place. Civil society organizations have put in place, bringing diversity into the cybersecurity arena, helping build skills, is really a key contribution that civil society can make. Again, taking the practitioner's lens for a moment, building upon the comments on international norms and code of practice.
Thank you so much, and I'm just so glad to hear like this very proactive and active, way of implementing, of bringing the different actors together that can make a difference, and this type of cooperation. So I'm very excited to see how we can build that forward, especially in the coming years, and a year or 2 years, I think, are going to be very important as we are looking at this both from the open-ended working group point of view and our discussions collecting. Now, the question to Brad: call to action.
Well, first of all, I think everybody's covered this extremely well, and this focus on strengthening norms, especially some days those that exist, implementing them, building capacity around them. But I would also look at it and say, I just think fundamentally we need to remember and learn some lessons from the past and then apply these with a real focus on some priorities for the future. Governments have not only a unique but uniquely important role to play in all of this, but multi-stakeholderism can be indispensable. And I would say it's not new. I think multi-stakeholderism was really invented in Europe, in Geneva, where you live, in 1863, when Henri Dunant brought the governments of Europe together, founded the Red Cross, and began to inject a dose of humanity into battlefields that were characterized by major advances in weaponry. And out of that, there came a new norm to protect people in battle. Now, a century later, the International Committee of the Red Cross was able to extend that by bringing governments together in 1949 to protect civilians. And later in the 20th century, a group of one civil society organization had become a group of many. And specifically, I think civil society proved that it can be the conscience of the global community, as it did, in effect, to put landmines off limits. And if civil society had not done that and the Canadian government had not sponsored it, I think soldiers themselves, troops in battle, would face unnecessary threats that are now mostly gone from the world. Now, today's multi-stakeholderism, especially for cyberspace, extends beyond civil society to companies like ours, to business associations, because as Ann mentioned, we're part of the platform, and on a good day, we're part of the solution, and if we don't do our job well, we'll be part of the problem. And I think as you consider where all of this can go in the future, as we build on the norms that exist, I would just call out three very important pragmatic problems. We should invest in this if we care about patients in hospitals, because what we are seeing in the world today in part is ransomware attacks that focus on hospitals because criminal organizations operating in countries where the law is not being enforced have realized that their low budgets are putting their cybersecurity at risk. And so it's a classic case of an existing norm that needs affirmation. I think second, we should care about this if we use software in any part of our life, which we all do for, frankly, every part of our life. When you look at what happened when there is a ransomware attack on critical infrastructure, or when you see tampering of the software supply chain, as we did in the SolarWinds incident, we are seeing the violation of one of the oldest and most important and well-established norms in international law, the obligation on governments to avoid indiscriminate attacks that put civilians at risk. And so we need to stand up and take practical steps to implement this. And there are days where we might even see either new norms or norms that won't get, in my view, the broad support they deserve, even at the United Nations. When I look at the Paris call, I look at principle number 3, and it calls on all of us who have signed it and endorsed it to protect electoral processes, to protect democracy itself. And even if we can't bring the world's democracies together in New York or Geneva at the United Nations, it is a good thing that we bring them together in Paris for the Paris Call, because the Paris Call, in my view, is ultimately an alliance of the world's democracies. And there will be days when we will need to bring the world's democracies together to strengthen norms or even establish new ones, and then we'll build from there. So that should be the call to action, to strengthen and protect democracy, to protect people in hospitals, to protect the software supply chain on which all of us depend for every part of our daily lives. And for people who look at the diplomats who devote their careers to this, these are steps that impact everybody and have such potential, I think, to make the world a better place.
So thank you for that. We're almost at the end of our session, and we only have 5 minutes left. We have a lot of questions, though, from the larger online audience. And so I'm going to just pick one because we don't really have time. And I'm actually going to give it back to you, Brad, because this question is, how much of a challenge do non-state actors pose to cybersecurity, and how can this challenge be addressed?
Well, I think non-state actors pose a challenge, and non-state actors provide an opportunity every day. There's civil society, but let's just pause and think for a moment about the role of actors that create and deploy technology. There are those of us who strive to be a force for good. At least that's what we strive to do every day. But I also appreciate that in the world today, people look at technology platforms and they want to ensure that we're responsible, and they want to ensure that we're subject to norms and the rule of law. And I think that is part of this as a global conversation, as well as in each country, and it should be. But I also think we have to worry deeply about non-state actors as potential sources of cyber attacks, really in two different contexts. The one is criminal organizations that are staging and engaging in ransomware and those who are financing them. I think we need to address that. The other is, so-called private sector offensive actors, what I think of as really, unfortunately, in the world today, 21st century mercenaries. Unfortunately, there are more governments with money than with the people and capacity to build their own cyber weapons. And if we are not careful, I'd say we already, unfortunately, have not always been careful in every country around the world. We end up creating an environment that creates a business opportunity for a company to create and sell weapons that are being used offensively in ways that also violate the international norms we're discussing here. So at bottom, every day in the private sector, we're either part of the problem or we're part of the solution.
Yes, lots of big threats that are on the horizon, as well as opportunities, as you said. I want to also mention that my organization is carrying out a mapping study funded by the Swiss government to look at private cyber companies working in, private security and maybe these other kinds of functions. We'll have should have the results next summer, so it's something that we also consider very important. And on that note, I'm going to start to close the panel. Unfortunately, people have to go, but it's been so interesting. Calls to action, I just want to mention implementation, capacity building, bringing the different actors together from both local, national, international levels, as well as private and different private sector actors, a whole multi-stakeholder approach. There's a lot to do. I think we have some very good calls to action. I want to thank all of my panelists for their contributions and their great ideas. And let's see how we can make 2022 another banner year, maybe even better banner year for cybersecurity, peace online. Thank you very much.